Pokemon's upcoming Legends Z-A game is slated for a 2025 release, but as of yet, we've seen no gameplay. The first few generations of Pokemon gave it such a good foundation conceptually that subsequent generations have just needed to make a few improvements and modernize a bit compared to the last, and obviously add a few new exciting features here and there. But I think we can all agree that while Scarlet and Violet did move the franchise forward in some regards, there are definitely areas for improvement when it comes to what they look like. So in this video, we're going to talk about the future of Pokemon graphics. There have been two instances in the last few years where Pokemon have announced a title that's meant to hype everyone up, and my personal reaction has honestly just been shock at how the biggest franchise in the world has managed to produce something that looks so horrendous. And yes, I'm talking about BDSP and Scarlet and Violet. Now, BDSP admittedly is more of a stylistic preference issue, with those chibi graphics being divisive to say the least, especially when we saw it in the Nintendo Direct with no idea that Legends Arceus was being announced straight after. And thank God it was, because if BDSP was the only Gen 4 service, well, I dread to think. But really, Scarlet and Violet is the main issue here. In my opinion, this is the first time ever that a brand new generation of Pokemon has actually looked worse than its predecessor. Sword and Shield may have been super linear and unfinished in their own way, but they looked clean and they ran smoothly. Bar the tree criticism, which I always thought was a little bit over the top. Legends Arceus clearly addressed those concerns by looking even better and being far more open world and less linear. When Pokemon decided to drop a trailer for Gen 9, however, I really did have that moment of, oh my god, no. The open expanse looked largely uninteresting to me, which eventually was the case in the final games we got, with these empty towns you could barely explore. The game looked significantly worse than Legends Arceus, which came out just a year before. And the frame rate, how they allowed a trailer, let alone the final game, to come out in that state is kind of beyond me. Clearly their stance was either that it looked acceptable, worryingly, or more likely that it would be acceptable to trade visuals for mechanics and gameplay, making it much more open world than ever before. But visually, yuck. The repetitive looped NPC animations, the 2 FPS wind turbines, the Pokemon that get stuck inside walls, the aimless wandering and disappearing from lifeless NPCs that we saw way back on the handheld systems, not to mention the most glitches I have ever seen in a new Pokemon game in terms of affecting the average player. Yes, it brought some humour, but equally outrage, and rightly so. And don't get me started on that stupid wave animation. Now, whilst upscaling Pokemon and innovating is always going to come with teething issues, it's very clear that Pokemon could do more. And to be fair, the team that developed it were probably under time pressure from the corporate side of the Pokemon company to hit deadlines. And in all fairness, in the end, they stuck the landing in a lot of ways. But you can't escape the fact that this was their 5th title on the Switch, and I think most would agree, the worst looking and most broken out of all of them. As fans, it's our job to think about the potential of Pokemon, to dream up what it could be in the future, and hold Pokemon to high standards in every regard. So as much as I enjoyed elements of Scarlet and Violet from a gameplay perspective, and I'd even go as far to say it has moved the franchise on in some regards, the bottom line is that the end product just wasn't good enough on a visual level. And as well as being a Nintendo fan, I'm also a big PlayStation fan. And I'm sure whether you're a PlayStation, PC or Xbox person, you've probably played titles in recent years on those systems that look visually stunning. And ironically, you've probably even had that experience on the Switch itself. But the amount of times I've been sitting there playing Spider-Man, The Last of Us, Metal Gear Solid, and seeing these beautiful visuals, landscapes and lighting effects, and thinking, wow, imagine if someone, somewhere, just used their skill, time, and effort to make something this visually stunning in a Pokemon game. It's physically possible, and that's what's so frustrating. The only barriers are the Nintendo hardware and the Pokemon company themselves, plus the universal appeal bubble that they've perhaps smartly positioned themselves in. And that may change somewhat if and when the new Switch system comes out, hopefully next year. But even if the hardware gets to that point, you still need Pokémon to willingly invest in these visual enhancements on the development side. As we mentioned, one clear barrier to this could be that they want to keep Pokémon universally appealing, meaning it will likely always be somewhat grounded in the Japanese cartoony visual style and remain kid-friendly. So from that perspective, there needs to be elements of colour and certain universally appealing styles of character design, for example. But I think you'd be surprised at how well a more adult-looking Pokémon game might sell, even if they did it as a bit of a side experiment, but still closely tied it to the main series. Perhaps with the Colosseum sub-series, for example. Legends Arceus for me is the best looking Pokémon game to date. And if they can build on that sort of style for future titles, and if they could add enough features to give it high replay value, I think with that combination they would really be on to a winner. Now, whilst I've compared Pokémon to gritty, realistic war titles, I obviously don't expect Pokémon to go for that exact adult style in the main series at this point. I just hope to see the day they decide to use that level of care and attention to the visuals without sacrificing on other areas. PlayStation's Spider-Man and other Marvel titles are pretty colourful and universally appealing games at times. So maybe in this comparison I've put forward, those sorts of games could be a decent reference point if Pokémon chose to really go all out with the graphics in future, even if it was just as an experiment. After all, Pokémon has been around since 1996, and so many of its fans are in their 20s, 30s, and more generally are the adult demographic. If Pokémon wants to sustain and position itself as a truly universal and family-friendly brand in the long term, a little bit like Disney and Marvel have for decades now, it needs to cater to the adults as well, and get that balance right. Yes, despite what the boomers will tell you, it's not just a kid's game. Obviously it's kid-friendly, but think of Pokémon like a heartwarming blockbuster, and as I mentioned, like a Marvel, Star Wars or a Disney. It's supposed to be a brand for all ages, so maybe making a game that's as grown up as the original fans now are wouldn't be such a bad idea. Maybe Pokémon needs its Blade. It's not the 9-year-olds farming raid drops, making incredible ROM hacks, and competing in international championships. Mostly. But all jokes aside, I think we've made a pretty good case there that Pokémon need to improve their games graphically. And we can only hope that the next Nintendo console gives the developers the tools to do that and push the games even more. Whether that's with Pokémon Z-A, any potential title before Pokémon Z-A, or Gen 10. Now I have a few other similar areas I want to speculate on and discuss in this manner. The next one being voice acting. So stay tuned for the next video, and as always, leave your thoughts and opinions down in the comments. Until next time, love you gang.